for a long, long time. So you have some wisdom to share. Can you let's start out just talking about the structures. So like you said, these are 3-season tunnels. They're a little bit different. They don't have the sides. They don't have supplemental heating. What is it about this type of system that you like compared to a more traditional high tunnel?
Well, these kind of tunnels here provide us with a lot of extra airflow. You can see if you look down the tunnels, we can actually open these up. Today is quite cool out here, but on warm days, we can open these up almost 6 feet on each side. Once you're inside, it's almost no different than being outside. But we have the ability to go through and pull them down on cool nights or during heavy rains to make sure everything is protected and provide ourselves a little bit of insurance.
Yeah, and you've got an unusually long tunnel. How long are these tunnels?
These are 500 feet.
Okay.
Yep. Every tunnel here that we're looking at on this side are 24 feet wide by 500 feet long. We like to figure each one of them is exactly 1/4 of an acre.
Okay. So we're standing here because we're kind of split between two systems, your determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. So let's just talk a little bit about trellising systems. I know a lot of growers tend to favor indeterminate tomatoes in high tunnels. I think just because you have this expensive space and you get to grow vertically. What is it about determinate tomatoes that has made you stick with this system, at least for some of your production?
Well, for us, our determinate tomatoes, we plant sequentially. We plant every few weeks. So we're constantly picking off of fresh plants every 3 to 4 weeks. Now, even though we may be picking on our final planting right now, our first planting is still putting out tomatoes. So we've discovered that keeping with these determinants, we don't get quite so tall, we can get more plants per acre, and it's a little easier for us to manage.
Okay. And what is the breakdown of, like, what percentage of your tomato production is determinate versus indeterminate?
We're probably 80% determinate versus 20% indeterminate.
Okay. And then let's just look really quick at your trellising system for your indeterminate tomatoes. Can you just explain the system and why you chose this over, I mean, there are many options you have for indeterminate.
This is a system that a lot of our guys have brought to us with their experience from Mexico. This is a system that has a high tensile wire that runs down. There's 2 wires for each plant. We try to run leaders on each plant, so we run 1 leader to each side. That way each plant turns into 2. What that does for us is make sure that we do a lot of pruning to keep to those 2 main leaders. The reason we want to stay to 2 leaders is ventilation, airflow, and make sure we get a little light all the way down to that plant.
Yeah, and it looks like you are not doing a lower and lean system, you're just leaving them in place.
We leave them vertical.
Okay. And is that also just to continue to allow more airflow to come in?
More airflow, labor savings. Every time you have to move something, the more it costs you.
Yep. Okay. And then I guess one final question. I guess the type of tunnel lends itself to this system. I know in some of your other tunnels, you have like the really reinforced roofs where you can just directly tie it up versus building a trellis.
Correct. These roofs here are not structurally sound.
Yeah.
If we went to tie these tomatoes up to the peak here, this whole tunnel would collapse. It's not designed. We actually break. You can see the angle iron on these 6-inch posts. We've actually broken a lot of these 6-inch posts with so much weight that's being pulled on them. The high tensile wire, we break quite a few wires. We have to re-ratchet them back together, tie them together. The tube steel that holds the wires, we bend that quite often. You just get a lot of weight on these little plants.
Yep. Okay, so the next thing I want to ask you about is nutrient management and irrigation. So the big problems that I often see in high tunnel tomatoes are like blossom end rot, yellow shoulder, these things that are kind of at the intersection of water management and nutrient management. So I guess what would you say your approach is in terms of what you're doing up front with soil fertility versus the kind of day-to-day supplemental, like through the drip line or foliar applications?
Yep. What we've done here, we used to be much heavier into pre-plant fertilizer. We used to come through and, well, if a little bit's great, a lot is even better. Well, we've changed our mentality quite a bit around here, and instead of giving a lot of food right away, we come in and we try to spoon feed these things all summer long. We're trying to constantly keep a balance in that plant and giving it what it needs when it needs it. We don't need to provide a lot of potassium in that plant when they're young. We're trying to put nitrogen and phosphorus down to get that plant up, get some flowers going. And then as we get a little part later in the fall, then we switch our program over to a little more potassium. Now we will do tissue analysis, sap analysis on our tomato plants.
And how frequently are you doing tissue samples or sap samples?
Every 2 weeks.
Are you doing both at the same time?
Right now we are currently
transitioning?
just using sap analysis.
Okay.
Yep, every 2 weeks. Basically, you take the sample 1 week, you get the results the following week, you make your corrections, and then you see the following week's test whether those corrections did you any good.
Yeah. So this may not be a fair question since you're not growing organically, but would you do it differently if you were? I know you have a few more options in terms of things that are immediately available for those quick corrections.
Yeah, if we were growing organically, you know, you could probably use the same system. You just got to come up with different supplies of your nutrients.
Yeah. So I know that you talked about this a little bit with your high tunnel raspberries with Annie, but can you tell me a little bit about irrigation? How are you making sure that you're supplying really consistent moisture?
We
to
are
your
walking
plants?
those tunnels every time we're watering. You know, the easy way to do it is to turn on the valve, hook up your fertigation. Okay, that fertigation's going down. We got water to them. But did you really? Did you really get it all the way across the whole tunnel? Mm-hmm. If you're not walking, we have guys that walk the tunnels up and down as they're watering. They will find plug drip tape. Yep. Areas of drip tape that, well, maybe there was a cut in it, or even though we're inside high tunnels, deer do walk in here at times, and the hooves will cut the drip tape. Yep. Did a guy cut one when he was pruning? You're constantly walking through and trying to figure out, keep it the most evenly balanced irrigation you can.
Yep. And how about insect issues? We see different insects in the tunnel than we do in the field.
Yeah, one of our biggest insect issues are, we have two main pests that we deal with in tomato production in our high tunnels. First one would be two-spotted spider mite. Mm-hmm. Basically, being inside a tunnel, the natural enemy to a two-spotted spider mite is rain. We're taking that natural enemy away. Yeah. The other enemy that we deal with a lot, or pest we deal with a lot, is citrus thrips. Okay. We have a lot of thrips and western flower thrips that we deal with in the tunnels.
So I know that you have done quite a bit of work, probably more than most other growers, with biocontrol.
Yep.
What does that look like? Are you just preventatively?
Tomatoes are one of the few things we are not doing any biocontrol on. With the fine hairs on the plants, yeah. We work a lot with different biological suppliers and beneficial suppliers. And with the fine hairs on them, we have issues with the beneficials being able to walk the plants and find the pests. Now, works real well for us on cucumbers, yep. melons, peppers, and other crops, but not so well on tomatoes.
Okay, so you're just relying on very active scouting.
Active scouting. We do a lot of spot spraying.
Okay.
We try to hit the hot spots before it becomes a major problem. Mm-hmm. You know, everything we do here is if we can find the problem when it's small enough, you can control it a lot easier than when it becomes a large problem. Yep. And then just control those small areas. You know, don't get me wrong, there's times when we have to control everything. It happens. But mm-hmm. we try to start small and then work our way up.
Okay. So one of the kind of main sections of this that I want to focus on is disease management. Yep. For a lot of reasons, high tunnel tomatoes are very challenging from a disease perspective, mostly because it's so hard to rotate them, because they're so high value that it's really hard to justify using that space for something else. So I guess the first part of the question is, can you just tell us a little bit about some of the other things that you have experimented with to be able to rotate? We just saw some melons, some cucumbers.
Almost everything we use here is a broadleaf, whether it be peppers, strawberries, tomatoes. What we found is, well, we don't have much of a rotation. We've tried using lettuce as a rotation, maybe some sweet corn in the tunnels, but you hit the nail on the head when you can't justify raising those crops. You can't afford to plant those crops in a high tunnel and pay for those tunnels.
So one of the things that you do is grafting.
Correct.
Is that something that you've always done, or like when did you make that shift? Do you do it yourself? Do you buy them pre-grafted?
Okay. We have tried doing our own grafting. We made that shift probably about 10 years ago. We've done grafted and non-grafted. Currently, everything we have in tomato plants is grafted.
Okay.
10 years ago, 12 years ago, we had this great idea of trying to graft our own plants. And the first year we grafted, I think we grafted 1,000 plants, and we had a grand total of 0 that made it.
Okay.
Yep. You know, every year we try something. The following year we got a few, and then we started seeing the benefits of the grafting. Currently, we subcontract that out.
Okay.
And have other growers do it for us. They're much more efficient at it than we are. Sometimes you got to admit you're not very good at doing something.
And how do you choose what rootstock you're going to use every year?
For us, we basically use the same rootstocks year after year. It's an old-fashioned rootstock.
Experimented and found one that works for you?
Yeah, we've trialed 4, 5, 6 different rootstocks. Some rootstocks, you use them because they add more vigor to the plant. Other rootstocks restrict the vigor.
Yeah.
We're always looking for disease control, especially for fusarium and pythium. We had a large issue many years ago with fusarium crown rot. We thought we were done growing tomatoes for a while, and then we started grafting, and we were able to get around that.
Okay. So speaking of different pathogens, you have a very unique pathogen here, which is Clavibacter.
Yeah, clavy is one of our favorite pests around here, we like to say. It's probably the one we manage the most for.
Yep.
When we first discovered we had Clavibacter, we didn't know what it was.
And when did you discover it?
About 10 years ago.
Okay. And I think you're still one of the only farms in Minnesota that has it, but we're starting to see it
lucky
pop
us.
up here and there.
Lucky
so
us.
we get to learn from you.
Well, we're very fortunate. We have a couple growers here that have dealt with this problem in Mexico. We've networked with other people that have dealt with it in other parts of the world, other parts of the country. You know, Minnesota, we haven't been growing up here as near as long as a lot of other places in the world have. So they've seen this a lot longer than we have. And when we first had people out, they're like, oh, it's not a big deal, just don't grow tomatoes there for 50 years. Well, it's like, do we really want to move all these tunnels and move tomato production somewhere else? Then you had other people come out and go, we deal with that down in Mexico all the time. We've dealt with it in Turkey. We've dealt with it in California. You just got to manage for it.
So what does that look like? On a daily basis, what are you doing?
On a daily basis,
anything
it's sanitation.
else?
It really is sanitation. It's making sure that guys and gals understand where this clavy is, not touching it and transmitting it from plant to plant to plant. When you switch one task to another or move from an area that has Clavibacter, you need to sanitize yourself. For us, we'll make a solution of hydrogen peroxide and water just to kind of
And people
sanitize.
wash their hands? Do they
wash
change
our
their
hands,
clothes?
we change our clothes, we wash our clothes. We don't wear the same clothes day after day. If we worked in an area with Clavibacter, we wash those clothes that night. Typically when we do work in a Clavibacter area, it's the last thing we do that day. We don't want it to be the first area we pick in the morning and transfer it to every other plant. When we first got Clavibacter, it was very scary. We were losing a whole tunnel in a couple days going, what are we going to do? But you learn to manage it. You learn that you have to get rid of some plants. You have to stop the spread.
So you're going through on a daily basis, a weekly basis, and pulling things that have signs of Clavibacter?
We will go
what does
through.
That look like?
Before we identify and confirm we have Clavibacter on the farm, we have one person that walks every tunnel every day. And typically Clavibacter will manifest itself on tomatoes that are under the most stress. And tomatoes are under the most stress when they're just starting to ripen and put out, when they have the heavy clusters of fruit on them. And that's typically where you find it. But we will walk every tunnel just to make sure nothing is showing up.
And then you just pull out those plants entirely?
When we find that we have a plant, we'll cut it out, we'll bring it down to you, we'll have them test it. Just to make sure this is what we're dealing with. And there's been times we thought we've had clavy and it's not. It's always a good feeling. Once we've confirmed we've got clavy, we block off the whole tunnel here if we know this tunnel has Clavibacter.
And so in terms of additional things, so that's kind of the day-to-day. It looks like you've also got black plastic, even in your high tunnel.
Yep.
What are some other sanitation methods you use, either day-to-day or like at the beginning and end of the season?
Well, we tend to pressure wash all our stakes,
Yep.
clean all our stakes, sanitize all our stakes. We'll dip them in like an oxidate solution just to make sure we're not transferring that year to year. We do have the benefit of being in Minnesota. We do have cold. Whether or not that helps or not, we'll let the experts argue over it. We believe it does help to let that cool temperature sanitize the stakes a little bit for us, but we try to do it other ways as well.
Yeah.
Big thing is making sure everybody understands the standard operating procedure when you have Clavibacter. You don't want a new guy walking in and, whatever, I'll just walk through and spread it to the next 3-4 tunnels. We've had that happen. So now we really try to make sure everybody is aware. We'll have meetings in the morning of the day after we find it, and everybody has the understanding of controlling the spread. Because once you can control the spread, you can kind of control it as best as you can.
Yeah. So backing up a little bit, I wanted to ask you about just soil health in your tunnels.
Yep.
Obviously, soil health is related to disease management, nutrient management, everything. And you have particularly sandy soil here.
Correct.
So what has been your approach over the years to build soil organic matter and
Well, one of the things a lot of people don't understand about on this farm is when we first started farming it, our soil tests would show us 0.5% organic matter. I mean, that's as sandy as it gets.
Yep.
So we started doing cover crops. We started producing our own compost.
How often are you doing cover crops in the tunnels?
We no longer do them in the tunnels.
Okay.
Some of the tunnels will get it if we pull an early crop onions or we pull something early out. We'll put some daikon radishes or some of that down. But typically what we're doing is we are creating our own compost. We're using horse manure. We have our own cattle herd, so we use our own cow manure and then put it on top of pasture hay, rotate that for a couple of years, tip it over, spread it in here every fall,
Okay.
and then incorporate it in with our fall tillage.
Yep. And what is your spacing that you use?
Typically, we're
variety
5 foot
dependent.
on center on our rows, 24 inches on center on our indeterminates, or our determinants. Our indeterminates, we're 6 foot on center on our rows, and anywhere from 12 to 16 inches on our plants, depending upon what we're growing.
Okay. So we are reaching the end of the season this year. Can you tell us a little bit about how you deal with like residue management, cull piles? Because again, when you're growing in the same space every year, that's a really important thing to be able to take that residue out. So how do you clean up after the season's over?
If you came out in a few weeks, after things froze and after we're done harvesting, you will see us hauling plant after plant after plant to a compost pile about a half mile down the road. We get rid of all of our plant debris, all of our leftover tomatoes. It all gets hauled out of here. I don't want to incorporate that into the soil.
That's a buried pile, isn't it? I know some of your piles are buried.
This is an above ground
Okay.
pile. This is an above ground pile that we put all the plants on, and then we'll turn it and we'll spread that on ground that we're going to grow corn, soybeans, or wheat on. Now our tomatoes, they'll go into a buried pile.
Okay.
More or less, so we can get everything in there. If there's any disease or pathogen, we can cover that up and heat it up.
Okay.
But we don't want to incorporate any possible disease, any Clavibacter, anything for the following season. We want to get it all cleaned up and clean everything the best that we can.
And when you say you heat it up, it sounds like you're pretty carefully monitoring that compost.
We will monitor our compost. We have a thermometer to put in there and then turn it every so often.
Yep.
But we will not return that compost of tomatoes back to our high tunnels. That will go out to the field that will not have tomatoes.
So then all of your compost that comes into your tomatoes comes from, you said, pastures, manure.
Yep, pasture hay, manure, things that we know will not carry pathogens from the tomatoes.
Yep. All right. So I guess in summary, it sounds like some of the most important things that you're saying are adequate spacing. Don't feel the need to squish things in too tightly just because it's a high value environment. Sanitation every day.
Yep.
Getting in there, actually feeling the soil when you're irrigating.
Yep,
investing
we
in
tend to
some
be a
tissue
very
sampling.
hands-on farm around here.
Yeah. And it's paying off. We've got great looking tomatoes.
Hopefully.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Hi,
All right.
everyone. I'm Nat.
All right, we will go ahead and take a few questions. If you have questions on irrigation or clavibacter specifically, we are going to move into just a few slides right after, but we'll take a few questions right now. If you could please put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat, that helps us sort through our questions a little more efficiently. And if you have a specifically lengthy question you want to try and unmute yourself, if you could raise your hand, and we can certainly give that an option too. We do have one in the Q&A already. How often do you prune the indeterminates?
How often do we prune the indeterminates? We will walk our indeterminates, especially once they get going, once a week. Our goal is to do it once a week. When we fall behind, tends to take twice as long if you don't get it done quite on time.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, and then we can, oh, here's another one. How often are you irrigating tomatoes in the tunnel?
We irrigate our tomatoes based on the weather. Typically, we'll try to irrigate every other day. When it's very hot, dry conditions, we will irrigate every day. If it's cool and damp, we may go 3 to 4 days. It all depends on what Mother Nature throws at us.
Okay. Okay, Natalie, do you want to share your screen right now, or did you want to do a, whoop, there's Bunch popping in. Hang on one second. What varieties?
Yeah, why don't we do a couple more?
Yep. What varieties are you growing that aren't grafted?
Currently, everything that we raise are grafted. Every variety we're going after is a grafted tomato.
Okay. When you are harvesting, what style of harvest containers do you use, and do you have harvest from both sides?
When we harvest, we use our cardboard tomato boxes, and we put our tops on the bottom so we don't fill any of the boxes with soil. And then we drag them down, and we do harvest from both sides.
Okay. What are your favorite varieties?
Oh, it depends on what we're doing. You know, we love using different types of grape tomatoes, some sweethearts. You know, I love growing Brandywine, some Cherokee purples for indeterminates, for heirloom varieties. Determinants, you know, we've grown so many different varieties. And one thing that I've really kind of learned is every type of tomato kind of tastes different depending on who's raising it and where it's raised. Certain varieties other people raise, we'll look at and go, that's not quite what we were looking for. But when they raise varieties that we don't care for, they turn out great in their tunnels or in their environment, and not exactly the way, exactly the same in our environment.
Okay. All right. Any other questions that we'll get to the irrigation question in a minute, but any other questions?
There's a question here about leaf mold as well, and I will briefly address that in this short presentation.
Okay. Natalie, did you want to do the irrigation?
Yeah.
Well,
I'll start with the clavibacter slides.
okay.
So this is just going to be like a 5-minute presentation just to kind of build on a little bit of what we talked about. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for more questions.
Okay.
So let me share my screen here. All right. I assume you can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, and actually, I noticed Michelle Grabowski is on this call. Michelle was the plant pathologist at with Extension and now works for MDA. I know she's been working with clavibacters. Michelle, if you want to, don't want to put you on the spot, but you can say a few words about it at the end too, if you want to. So This is a pathogen that is showing up in Minnesota high tunnels. It's not very widespread at this point, as far as we know. I think MDA is doing some tracking of it, but it's one that is worth knowing about and at least kind of being preventative about. So Clavibacter is a bacteria, Clavibacter michiganensis. And actually on that last slide, this was the first time that I saw it. So this picture is the first time that I saw it. And I will just say, like, when I first saw it, I was kind of the yellow shoulder type symptoms were so obvious that was the first thing that stood out to me. But then in looking much more closely at the leaves, it was clear that something else was going on. So the leaf symptoms are pretty distinct. You've got these kind of brown spots on the edges with a really distinct yellow halo around them. You can see spots like this on the fruit, but you definitely do not always see those spots. So it's a bacteria that invades the xylem tissues. So xylem is the tissue that plants use to move water. So once it enters that system, it can move pretty quickly through the plants. You start to see this kind of browning of the internal vascular tissues of the xylem. And eventually it can interfere with water transport. So the early infection signs often just look like wilting because you can get some interference with water transport. And then over time, that kind of browning and decay of the stem tissues can end up more like this bottom picture where the stems actually kind of start to crack. And so the main source of this bacterium is seeds. And so just being really careful about where you're getting your seeds from, checking with the people you're buying transplants from, just making sure that they're taking precautions is a really great way to prevent it. And then once it's on your farm, it can also spread through contaminated soil and plant disease or plant debris. I've read it can contribute to soil-borne infections up to 4 years. I think the extension page says 3 years, so somewhere between 3 and 4 years. And this is a bacteria that spreads via water. So if you look at this last picture of the leaves, it almost looks a little bit like black rot in broccoli, just in the way that it kind of starts to show symptoms on the leaves. That's usually only if it enters through the leaves though. So just like black rot, it can enter through those hydrothodes. So the little holes on the edge of the leaf margins that allow for transport of water. It can enter through stomata, as well as just any wounds. So from pruning or any other wounds or natural openings in the plants. And so just a couple management pieces. Getting certified pathogen-free seed is one of the best things you can do. I don't think many people are actually saving seed from high tunnels, but if you are, you can hot water treat that seed. There are instructions on the Extension Clavibacter page. Disinfecting tools and equipment. So Paul did a really, really good job of talking about this. You saw how seriously they take this pathogen and just preventative management in general. On another farm that I know has it, they have it in one tunnel, but not the other. And so they have completely separate boots and clothes and tools that they use in that tunnel just to make sure that they're not spreading it from tunnel to tunnel. So just basic sanitation, removing infected plants. Paul did a really good job of covering that. It's worth saying there are not a lot of good chemical options for this pathogen. And so really focusing on cultural and preventative control is key. There are formulations of copper, often mixed with bactericides like mancozeb, that can have an effect. There's actually only one product listed in the Midwest Guide. So generally, focusing on preventative control is your best approach. And unfortunately, there are no commercially available cultivars with resistance to this pathogen. The final thing, this is not necessarily a recommendation, but I do know that at least one farm in Minnesota that has Clavibacter has switched to hydroponics in their high tunnel as a way of keeping their tomatoes off the ground. So that's not necessarily a recommendation, but it is kind of a creative approach that one farm is trying. And then I'm not going to talk about these very much right now, but just to kind of point out, there are a number of other really common high tunnel pathogens. And this is actually Michelle's work. So in
2014, Michelle Grabowski and Angela Orshinsky sampled 15 different high tunnels and found leaf mold in 100% of them. So someone had a question about leaf mold, and I will post that link in the chat to the extension page about leaf mold as soon as we're done here. 100% had early blight and 90% had gray mold. So Clavibacter is not by far like the most widespread pathogen in high tunnels. These three are pathogens you should be thinking about every single year and managing alongside any other preventative management. And so I'm not going to go in depth on any of these, but in general, humidity management and having good ventilation is one of the main things that leads to some of these pathogens becoming kind of problematic in high tunnels. Just again, good sanitation. So removing crop residues, sterilizing equipment, sterilizing even like the walls of your high tunnels and everything that was inside your high tunnel at the end of the year. And then with some of these, so leaf mold and early blight, there are resistant varieties available, but not gray mold. So with that, I have a slide about irrigation as well, but if anyone wants to ask a question about any of these pathogens, we can take a second. So Tim asked, is Clavibacter limited to high tunnels or can it infect any tomato crop? And it is not limited to high tunnels, but that seems to be where we're seeing it. And that's something where, Michelle, if you want to say something, I know MDA is kind of monitoring this pathogen, so you may have a better sense of how widespread it is. But it is not limited to high tunnels theoretically. And then Chris asked about leaf mold. So I'm going to post just a link right now in the chat box to everybody. And this is the extension page about leaf mold in tomatoes. So on the extension website, there's actually really good information about most of these pathogens. So definitely take some time to look into those pages. Okay, and these are all some really specific virus questions. So I'm going to go on to irrigation, and then some of these I'm going to have to look up as we go. So someone asked about irrigation and moisture probes. So let's move on to talk about irrigation here. So John, you were going to pull